Kill him. Do it where they can see. Kareem al-Rashid said it quietly, which made it worse. No rage, no hesitation. Just 4 words delivered like a man ordering dinner. His bodyguard dragged the bound American contractor to his knees in the center of the valley, in full view of every surveillance camera, every satellite, every scope pointed at that mountain, because Kareem knew he had just survived 2 shots from the most legendary sniper in the United States Navy. 2 shots, 2 misses, and now he wanted the whole world watching when he answered back. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, if you believe that real courage deserves to be told, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because what happened on that mountain is something every single person needs to hear. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the mountains, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street or a library after closing time. This is a living silence, a heavy, pressurized quiet that wraps itself around you like a physical thing and makes every small movement feel enormous. The kind of silence where the sound of your own heartbeat becomes the loudest noise in the world. Jack Callahan had lived inside that silence for 15 years. He knew it better than he knew the sound of his wife's voice, better than the sound of his children laughing on a Saturday morning. He had spent so many thousands of hours lying motionless in elevated positions, on rooftops, in tree lines, on rocky hillsides exactly like this one, that the silence had stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a part of himself, something he wore, something he inhabited, something that belonged to him as completely and naturally as his own hands. And those hands were the thing people talked about when they talked about Jack Callahan. In the SEAL community, a world full of extraordinary men and women, a world where excellence was the baseline requirement and anything less was simply not acceptable, Jack's hands were legendary. The senior operators who had seen everything, done everything, survived everything they still talked about, those hands in the kind of hushed, respectful tones usually reserved for forces of nature, for things that exist outside of ordinary human experience. The man doesn't have hands. His first commanding officer had told a group of junior operators during a training session years ago. He has instruments, precision instruments. I've watched him hold a shot for 6 minutes in 40-mile-per-hour winds without moving a single muscle. I've watched him adjust for a target change in less than 3 seconds. I've watched him do things with a long gun that I would have told you were physically impossible if someone had described them to me instead of letting me see them with my own eyes. The junior operators had listened with the wide-eyed attention of people hearing a story they weren't sure they fully believed. But every single one of them believed it, because they had seen the records. 15 years of deployment records that read like something out of a movie script, except that movie scripts required dramatic failures and near misses to create tension, and Jack's records contained almost none. Mission after mission, year after year, in countries most Americans had never heard of, and situations the public would never know existed, Jack had done what he was positioned to do. He had completed his objectives. He had protected his teammates. He had preserved innocent lives that would otherwise have been lost. And he had done it with a consistency that bordered on the supernatural. They called him the Clock, not because he was cold or robotic or emotionally disconnected, though some people who didn't know him assumed exactly that. They called him the Clock because he was that reliable, that steady, that absolutely dependably consistent in his performance. You could set your expectations by Jack Callahan the way you set your watch by an atomic clock. He was going to perform. He was going to succeed. The question was never whether Jack would complete the mission. The question was only how. He had earned that reputation the hard way, one mission at a time, one successful shot at a time. And for 15 years, that reputation had been the most powerful weapon he possessed, more powerful, in some ways, than the rifle itself, because the reputation preceded him everywhere he went. It created a psychological environment around every operation he participated in. His teammates trusted him completely. His commanding officers trusted him completely. And in those critical moments when an operation hung on a razor's edge between success and catastrophic failure, that trust was worth more than any tactical advantage. But tonight, on this freezing mountain in Afghanistan, with a temperature that had dropped to 12 degrees and a wind that was doing something Jack had never experienced in all his years in the field, something strange and irregular and deeply unsettling, the reputation was not helping him. In fact, tonight, the reputation was exactly the problem. The briefing had been direct. The intelligence was solid, or at least, that's what they had been told. Karim al-Rashid, a Yemeni national, with significant financial connections throughout the Gulf states and a long, well-documented history of facilitating weapons transfers for terrorist organizations across 3 continents, had arranged a meeting in this valley. The meeting was with 2 representatives of a Central Asian extremist network that had been actively seeking chemical weapons capability for the past 18 months. Karim had what they wanted: a stolen shipment of precursor chemicals materials that in the right hands could be weaponized into something capable of killing hundreds or thousands of people in a single attack. The intelligence suggested Karim would be present personally to oversee the transfer. The intelligence suggested the window would be small, perhaps 30 minutes. And the intelligence suggested that if Karim reached his armored vehicle with those materials, getting another shot at him would require months of additional surveillance and preparation, months that the people in Washington and Langley were not willing to give. One shot, the mission commander had said during the briefing, looking directly at Jack. "We need one clean shot. Can you give us that?" Jack had looked back at him without blinking. "Yes," he had said simply, not because he was arrogant, not because he was showing off, simply because it was the truth, and the truth required no elaboration. He had one-shot opportunities before many times. He had never failed to convert them. The insertion went flawlessly. 6 operators moving through terrain that would have challenged most soldiers, rocky, uneven, brutally cold, with visibility compromised by scattered cloud cover that kept blocking the ambient light. But the team was exceptional. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done exactly this kind of thing many times before, and within 90 minutes, they were in position on a ridge overlooking the valley below. Jack settled into his spot with the focused intentionality of a craftsman taking up his tools. Every movement was deliberate. Every adjustment was calculated. He tested the bipod. He checked the scope. He ran through his pre-shot routine with the careful attention of someone who understood that greatness was not inspiration, it was preparation, repeated so many times that it became automatic. He assessed the distance. He noted the temperature. He checked the wind indicators, the small pieces of vegetation he could see in the valley below, moving in the light air that drifted between the mountain walls. And then he waited. That was when he first noticed something was wrong. Not wrong with the target, not wrong with the team. Something wrong with the environment. Something subtle and difficult to name, like a smell that doesn't quite fit the location or a sound that's just barely outside the range of clear identification. The wind. There was something wrong with the wind. Jack had spent 15 years reading wind. He had studied at formally ballistics courses, meteorology training, hours of classroom instruction from instructors who had dedicated their careers to understanding the invisible forces that governed the path of a projectile through air. And he had studied it informally, practically, experientially, thousands of hours in the field, watching the wind move through vegetation and across water and between buildings, developing an intuitive feel for it that went beyond anything you could teach in a classroom. He knew wind, but this wind was doing something he couldn't quite categorize. It was moving in directions that didn't make sense given the terrain. The valley below should have funneled the air in a predictable pattern that was basic geography, basic physics. But instead, the movement he was seeing in the vegetation below was irregular, inconsistent, almost random. He frowned, checked his indicators again, ran the numbers in his head. The calculation came back clean. Everything looked correct. The shot, if the target appeared where the intelligence said he would appear, was manageable. Difficult, the range was significant, and the conditions weren't ideal, but absolutely within his capability. He told himself the wind was fine. He told himself his calculation was correct. He told himself the unease he was feeling was just fatigue, 2 days of minimal sleep, high altitude, the cumulative stress of years of deployment. Normal, manageable, nothing that the clock couldn't push through. He did not in that moment consider another possibility. He did not consider that the unease he was feeling might be his instincts trying to tell him something that his experience-based assumptions were refusing to hear. He did not consider that 15 years of success might have created a blind spot, a place where confidence shaded into assumption, where hard-won expertise began, very subtly, to calcify into certainty. He did not consider any of that, because the clock didn't miss. The target appeared at 18 minutes past the hour. Kareem al-Rashid was shorter than Jack had expected from the surveillance photographs, compact, dark-haired, moving with the brisk confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He emerged from a low structure on the far side of the valley and walked into the open, flanked by two bodyguards, moving toward a group of figures who had arrived from the opposite direction. "Target acquired," Jack said quietly into his mic. "Copy," came the response from the mission commander. "Authorization confirmed," said the voice from the satellite link. "You are clear to engage." Jack's breathing slowed. 3 breaths. Count them down. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow the heart rate. Reduce movement. Every sniper has a rhythm, and Jack's rhythm was as familiar to him as the beat of a well-loved song. 3 breaths. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The sound was enormous, it always was. No matter how many times you did it, and then the sound was gone, absorbed by the mountain, replaced by that living silence. Everyone waited, and then something impossible happened. The target was still standing. Jack stared through the scope with an expression that his teammates hadn't seen on his face before, an expression of pure, uncomprehending confusion. The shot had felt right. The breath had been right. The trigger pull had been right. The fundamentals had been exactly what they always were. And yet the target was still standing. "Miss," someone said quietly on the radio. The word hung in the cold air like something toxic. "Miss," Jack confirmed, his voice completely flat. And then before anyone could speak, before anyone could react or adjust or redirect, second shot. "Stand by." He worked the bolt. He reacquired the target. Kareem al-Rashid, who had heard the shot and understood immediately what was happening, was moving now, not running, not yet, because his bodyguards were pulling him down and trying to identify the threat direction, but moving, the geometry of the shot changing, the variables multiplying. Jack ran the numbers again. Fast, automatic. The calculation that 15 years had made as natural as breathing. He adjusted for the movement. He adjusted for what he thought he understood about the wind. He fired. The second shot went wide by more than the first. The silence that followed was different from any silence Jack had ever experienced on a mountain. It was the silence of disbelief. Behind him, he could hear the very specific quality of people not speaking because they had no idea what to say. The mission commander was not speaking. The team medic was not speaking. The communications officer was not speaking. Even the voice from the satellite link had gone quiet in a way that communicated shock more clearly than any words could have. On the valley floor below, Kareem al-Rashid was being hustled toward an armored vehicle by his bodyguards. The weapons transfer, interrupted by the shots, was dissolving, the other party scattering, the whole careful arrangement collapsing under the pressure of the attack they hadn't expected, and that had, against all probability, failed to connect. Kareem reached the vehicle. The door closed, and Jack heard it. Through the radio, through the intercept, through the extraordinary electronic infrastructure that the United States military deployed to support operations like this one, Jack heard it clearly. Kareem al-Rashid was laughing. It was not a frightened laugh, or a relieved laugh, or the kind of wild, adrenaline-fueled laugh that comes after surviving something terrifying. It was a contemptuous laugh, a dismissive laugh, the laugh of a man who had just been shot at by the best the Americans had to offer and had walked away completely unharmed, and who found the whole situation not terrifying but amusing. Proof of something he had always suspected about the men who hunted him, that they were overrated, that their reputation was larger than their reality, that the famous American sniper, the one they called the Clock, had choked when it mattered most. Jack Callahan heard that laugh, and something inside him, something that had been holding itself together for 15 years through sheer force of discipline and professionalism, and made a sound like a crack in old ice. "Clear the channel," the mission commander said. His voice was controlled, but barely. "We need to assess options." "Air support request, what's the timeline on that?" 15 minutes minimum, someone replied. "The vehicle will be through the tunnel in less than 5. We've lost the window." "Alternative ground options?" "None within range. So we're looking at a complete mission failure." Nobody answered that question directly, because nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. But the silence was its own answer. Jack lay behind the rifle that he had just failed to fire properly twice in the same mission for the first time in his entire career, and he tried to understand what had happened. He ran through the mechanics, obsessively, searching for the error. Was it the trigger pull? No, both pulls had felt clean. Was it the scope? He checked it again, and it was exactly where it should be. Was it his breathing, his body position, the bipod? He kept coming back to the wind that had felt wrong from the beginning, the wind he had overridden with his own confidence, because the clock had seen wind like this before, because the clock had 15 years of experience, because the clock didn't second-guess himself based on a vague feeling he couldn't quantify or verify, because the clock didn't miss. Except tonight, the clock had missed twice. And somewhere in the valley below, an armored vehicle carrying a man who traded in chemical death was driving toward a tunnel, and in 4 minutes, it would be through that tunnel, and then it would be gone, and the months of intelligence work and operational planning and human risk that had brought this team to this mountain would have produced just nothing except the sound of Kareem al-Rashid laugh. Jack. The mission commander's voice came through the earpiece. Quiet, not accusatory, just present. Talk to me. Jack opened his mouth, closed it. He had no words for what was happening. In 15 years of operations, in every difficult situation, every high-pressure moment, every mission where everything went sideways, he had always had words. He had always been the one speaking clearly and calmly while everyone else struggled to find their bearings. He had always been the anchor. Tonight, he was the problem. I need a minute, he said finally. We don't have a minute, the mission commander replied. And he was right. They both knew he was right. The armored vehicle was moving. The tunnel was getting closer. The mission was dissolving. And Jack Callahan, 15 years, dozens of missions, a reputation built on absolute reliability, had nothing left to offer. He became aware in that moment of a presence beside him, not in front of him, not behind him. Beside him, close, quiet, appearing the way shadows appear when the light shifts, gradually and then all at once. He had been so focused on the target, on the vehicle, on the catastrophe unfolding in the valley below, that he hadn't tracked the movement. He turned his head. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes was lying down beside him. She was looking at the valley below with an expression that Jack had never seen on her face before. Though truthfully, he realized with a sudden jolt of uncomfortable self-awareness, he had rarely looked at her face long enough to catalog its expressions. She was a support operator. She was always there, always present, always part of the team, but in the way that essential infrastructure is always present. You notice it when it fails. You don't spend much time studying it when it works. Hayes, he said, and then stopped, because he didn't know what came after that. Rachel didn't respond to him directly. She was looking at the vegetation on the valley walls, the way it moved, the pattern of it. The valley is creating a rotational airflow, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely steady. The walls are angled in a way that generates counter-rotation at different elevation levels. Your indicators were showing you surface movement. The bullet was traveling through a zone with completely different characteristics. That's why both shots drifted the same direction. Jack stared at her. He had been processing the missed shots for the past 3 minutes with the full force of 15 years of expertise, and he had not arrived at that explanation. Rachel Hayes had arrived at it in approximately 30 seconds of looking at moving vegetation. The vehicle reaches the tunnel in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, she said, and then she paused briefly, in a way that seemed less like hesitation and more like a person choosing their words very carefully. Commander, she looked at him directly. I have the shot. The silence that followed those 4 words was the most complicated silence Jack had experienced in 15 years of living inside difficult silences. It was made of about 17 different things simultaneously. Shock, disbelief, professional instinct, pushing back hard against an unexpected variable. Pride and emotion he recognized immediately and immediately hated himself for feeling. The logical voice that said the mission is failing, and this is your only remaining option. The emotional voice that said, but she has never. The mission commander's voice coming through the earpiece saying, what's the current status at the position? Because he had heard something, some shift in the quality of the radio silence, and needed to understand what was happening. Jack looked at Rachel. Her eyes were steady, not challenging him, not asking for permission in a way that carried doubt or apology, simply stating a fact and waiting for him to decide whether to accept it. He thought about the armored vehicle. He thought about what it was carrying. He thought about the people who would die if those materials reached their destination. He thought about the laugh. Commander, the mission commander's voice again. Talk to me. What is happening at your position? Jack Callahan took one breath. It was possibly the hardest breath of his life. Hayes has the shot, he said into the radio. Another silence. A different kind of silence. Say again? The mission commander's voice was carefully controlled. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Jack said, keeping his own voice level with an effort that cost him more than he expected, believes she has a viable shot on the target. I'm stepping aside. In 15 years, in dozens of missions, in countless situations that had tested him in every possible way, Jack Callahan had never said those words before. I'm stepping aside. They tasted like something he couldn't name. The mission commander was quiet for 2 seconds, which, in operational terms, was a very long time. Then copy that. What is Hayes' assessment? Rachel was already moving, not waiting for the official authorization, not waiting for the chain of command formality to complete its cycle, because there wasn't time for any of that, and she understood that better than anyone. She was settling into the position Jack had just vacated, adjusting things the bipod angle, the scope height, the body positioning with small, efficient movements that spoke of someone who had spent a great deal of time studying this exact weapon system. Jack moved aside and watched her and felt something that he would spend a long time afterward trying to properly identify. It wasn't quite admiration. It wasn't quite humility. It wasn't quite shame, though shame was part of it. It was something more complex than any of those single words, something that happens to a person when they see very clearly and very suddenly a truth about themselves that they had been successfully avoiding for a long time. He had missed the shot because he had trusted his reputation over his instincts. He had trusted what he knew over what he was seeing. He had trusted 15 years of experience over the present moment. And in doing so, he had failed. Rachel had no reputation to trust. She had only the present moment. 3 minutes, someone said on the radio. Vehicle clears the tunnel in 3 minutes. Rachel settled her breathing. She made a small adjustment to the scope. She looked at the valley one more time, at the vegetation, at the movement of the air, and her lips moved very slightly, as if she were running a calculation out loud, but too quietly for anyone to hear. Then she went completely still, and Jack, watching her from 2 feet away, saw something extraordinary. He saw someone who was not afraid. Not afraid of bravado or adrenaline or the psychological armor that operators build up over years of doing dangerous things. Not the performed calm that he himself had mastered, the discipline that looks like stillness but is built on a foundation of enormous internal effort. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone who had prepared so thoroughly, thought so carefully, absorbed so much information, that in this moment there was simply nothing left to be afraid of. No gap between preparation and execution. No uncertainty waiting to be managed. Rachel Hayes had been preparing for this shot for years. She just hadn't known it yet. The armored vehicle was moving faster now. Below on the valley floor, the situation was fluid and chaotic, bodyguards moving, the remnants of the transfer party still scattering, dust kicked up by the vehicle's movement catching in the strange, rotating air that Rachel had identified and that Jack had missed. 2 minutes and 30 seconds to the tunnel. Hayes, the mission commander's voice. Give me your confidence level. Rachel answered without hesitation, without moving her eye from the scope. High, she said. One word. And in that one word, Jack Callahan heard something he had been hearing in his own voice for 15 years and had never fully appreciated until he heard it in someone else's. Absolute certainty, earned not through arrogance but through preparation. He had a sudden, piercing understanding of what the clock had always actually meant. It had never been about him. It had always been about the preparation. He had simply been the most prepared person in the room for 15 years. Tonight he was not. 2 minutes, the radio said. The armored vehicle accelerated. Rachel's finger rested against the trigger, and Jack Callahan, for the first time in 15 years, was not the most important person on the mountain. He knew it. And for a reason he couldn't immediately explain, a reason that would take him months of quiet reflection to fully understand, knowing it did not feel like losing. It felt like something being set down. Something heavy that he had been carrying for so long he had stopped noticing the weight. He watched Rachel Hayes settle deeper into the position. He watched her breathe. He watched her become, in that moment, exactly what the mission needed her to be. 1 minute, the radio said. The tunnel mouth was visible through the scope, dark, wide, an opening in the mountain wall that in 60 seconds would swallow the vehicle and everything it contained. Rachel did not move. She did not rush. She simply waited with the particular patience of someone who is not performing patience, who actually genuinely has it, has cultivated it through years of being overlooked, underestimated, assigned to the margins while others occupied the center, watching and learning and preparing for a moment that everyone around her assumed would never come. 52nd. The vehicle was moving fast now. 30. Hayes, someone said on the radio, and the voice was tight with urgency. If you have the shot, you need to take it. Rachel's answer was not words. Her answer was the sound of the rifle firing. The rifle fired. And then there was nothing, no confirmation, no explosion, no immediate sign that anything had changed at all. Just the echo rolling back off the mountain walls, and the armored vehicle still moving, still accelerating toward the tunnel mouth, still carrying Kareem al-Rashid and everything he represented toward safety. For approximately 2 seconds, everyone on that ridge stopped breathing. Then the vehicle swerved. Not dramatically. Not the way vehicles swerve in movies with fire and noise and cinematic finality. It swerved the way a machine swerves when something critical inside it stops working, a subtle loss of control, a drift to the left, a hesitation in the forward momentum that didn't belong there. The driver was fighting it. You could see that through the scope, even from this distance, the vehicle correcting, overcorrecting, the front end dipping as the mechanical system Rachel had targeted began to fail in exactly the sequence she had predicted. It's losing drive, someone said on the radio. The voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a professional trying very hard not to sound as shocked as he actually was. Confirmed, said another voice. Vehicle is decelerating. It is not going to make the tunnel. The armored vehicle ground to a stop 40 meters short of the tunnel entrance. 40 meters. If Rachel's shot had been off by another 3 inches in any direction, Kareem would have been through that tunnel and gone. The mission would have been over. The months of preparation, the risk, the exposure of 6 operators on a freezing Afghan mountain, all of it wasted. 3 inches. Rachel Hayes lowered the rifle slightly and exhaled. One long, controlled breath. Then she was back at the scope because she already understood what everyone else on the ridge was still processing, that stopping the vehicle was not the same as completing the mission. Kareem al-Rashid was alive. He was in a disabled vehicle 40 meters from cover, surrounded by bodyguards, and the next 60 seconds would determine whether this became a success or simply a different kind of failure. Target is mobile. The mission commander's voice came through sharp and fast. He's out of the vehicle. I count 4, no 5 bodyguards. They are moving toward the tunnel on foot. Copy, Rachel said quietly. Hayes, do you have a visual? Working on it. What happened next was something that none of the operators on that ridge would ever fully agree on in their subsequent retellings of the story. Not because they weren't paying attention, every single person was paying intense attention, but because what Rachel did in the following 90 seconds operated at a level of situational awareness. That was genuinely difficult to follow in real time. She was doing multiple things simultaneously. Tracking the target's movement, recalculating for the new airflow patterns as the smoke from the vehicle's disabled engine began drifting through the valley, reading the bodyguard formation for gaps, and doing all of it while maintaining the absolute physical stillness that a shot at this range required. Jack was watching her from 2 feet away. He had not moved since stepping aside. He wasn't sure he was capable of moving. Something had happened to him in the moment when that vehicle swerved, some internal rearrangement that hadn't finished completing itself, and left him feeling like a man standing on ground that was still settling after an earthquake. He was watching Rachel work, and he was learning something. Not about rifles or wind or ballistics, something older than that, something more fundamental. He was learning what he looked like when he was at his best, because that's what he was seeing. Rachel Hayes in this moment was Jack Callahan at his absolute peak, except she was doing it without the 15 years of public acknowledgement that had always surrounded his performance. She was doing it without a reputation to lean on, without a team that expected her to succeed, without the psychological safety net of being the clock. She was doing it naked, in the most professional sense of the word, exposed to failure, in a way Jack had not been exposed to failure in over a decade, and completely, utterly unafraid. He found that almost incomprehensible. Then he found it humbling. Then slowly he found it clarifying. On the valley floor, the bodyguard formation was moving fast. 5 armed men surrounding one target, moving in the disciplined cluster that trained protection units use, bodies overlapping, angles constantly changing, the whole group flowing toward the tunnel entrance with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed exactly this scenario. Getting the principal to cover, minimizing exposure, making the shot as difficult as possible for whoever was up on that ridge. It was good technique. Against almost anyone else, it would have worked. 30 seconds to the tunnel, the communications officer said. His voice had an edge to it now that hadn't been there before, a tightness that reflected what everyone on the ridge was feeling. They had come so close. The vehicle was stopped. The target was slowed. But if Kareem reached the tunnel on foot, the result was the same as if the vehicle had made it through. He was gone. The mission was failed. And the chemical materials went with him. Hayes, the mission commander, again, talk to me. I see it, Rachel said. See what? What did you see? She didn't answer immediately. Her eye was at the scope, and her hands were completely still, and her lips were moving again in that barely audible way, running the numbers, processing the geometry, calculating something that the rest of them didn't have the information to understand yet. The formation has a gap, she said finally. Third bodyguard left. He's favoring his right side old injury, probably. Every 4 steps he compensates. It creates a half-second window. Jack processed what she had just said. She was reading an old injury in a moving bodyguard's gait from thousands of feet away through a scope while simultaneously calculating a shot on a different moving target in aberrant wind conditions under the most intense time pressure any of them had experienced tonight. That's not possible, someone muttered on the radio. Not as a challenge, just as a genuine, involuntary response to something the speaker couldn't quite make sense of. Rachel didn't react to it. 20 seconds, the communications officer said. The bodyguard formation was 15 meters from the tunnel entrance. 10 meters. Rachel took one breath, held it. Then something extraordinary happened, not the shot, not yet, but something that preceded the shot, something that Jack would later describe as the moment he understood the full dimension of what he was witnessing. Rachel shifted her aim point slightly, not toward Kareem, not toward any of the bodyguards, toward a position approximately 3 meters ahead of the formation, at the tunnel entrance itself, a specific point on the tunnel wall that, to everyone else on the ridge, appeared to be completely irrelevant. What is she targeting? Someone asked quietly.
Jack watched.
And then he understood. There was a structural support at the tunnel entrance. Concrete, old, partially degraded, the kind of infrastructure that gets built in remote mountain locations by people working with limited materials and gets maintained by nobody for decades. Rachel had identified it. She had looked at the tunnel entrance while everyone else was looking at the target, and she had identified a point where a single impact would create a result that was tactically far more valuable than trying to punch through 5 bodyguards in motion. She was going to collapse the entrance, not permanently, not dramatically, just enough to create an obstacle, enough to create confusion, enough to break the formation apart for the 3 seconds she needed to find the window. 15 seconds, the communications officer said. His voice was completely flat now, beyond urgency. Just information. Rachel fired. The support cracked. Debris fell across the tunnel entrance, and the bodyguard formation did exactly what trained protection units do. When something unexpected happens to the environment ahead of them, it reacted. Not retreated, not scattered, but reacted. The professionals in the group pulling the principal back, the others moving forward to assess the threat. The whole careful overlapping geometry of 5 bodies suddenly separating into individual decision makers for approximately 4 seconds while the group recalibrated. 4 seconds. The third bodyguard on the left stumbled slightly on his right side. The gap opened. Rachel fired. The sound hit the mountain walls and came back as an echo. And in the space between the shot and the echo, the entire ridge held its breath. Target is down, the communications officer said. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Just slightly. A professional crack in a professional voice that communicated more clearly than any elaborate expression could have the magnitude of what had just happened. Target is confirmed down. Mission complete. Nobody moved for a moment. Then someone on the ridge said Jesus in a very quiet voice, and it sounded less like a curse and more like a prayer. And it was the most honest response to the previous 90 seconds that any of them could have produced. Jack Callahan was looking at Rachel Hayes. She had lifted her eye from the scope. She was lying completely still, the way operators lie still after a shot, not moving, not celebrating, not doing anything that might compromise their position until the extraction sequence was confirmed. Her face was calm, not the performed calm of someone suppressing strong emotion, actually calm. The calm of someone who had done exactly what she came to do and was now waiting for the next step in the sequence. She had not looked at Jack. She had not looked at anyone. She was simply present and professional and completely, incomprehensibly composed. Jack opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Hayes. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were steady and dark and gave away absolutely nothing about what was happening inside her. That we stopped. Tried to find the right word and couldn't. Every word he reached for felt inadequate, extraordinary, incredible, impossible. All of them true and none of them sufficient. It was the shot that needed to happen, Rachel said simply. And then she turned back to the valley because the extraction sequence required attention and the conversation could wait. Jack stared at the side of her face for a long moment. Then quietly, so that only she could have heard it, he said, "I miss the wind." Rachel didn't respond immediately. A few seconds passed. Then, without turning her head, "You missed the second layer." The surface indicators were accurate. There's a second airflow pattern about 800 feet up that counter rotates in this valley formation. It affects the trajectory in the last third of the flight path. It's easy to miss if you're using experience-based assumptions instead of reading the current conditions. How long did it take you to identify it? About 4 minutes after we reached the position. Jack processed that. 4 minutes. He had been in position for 27 minutes before the target appeared, and he had not identified it. Rachel, in the background, in the place where background people go, where the support operators stand while the primary operators prepare, had identified it in 4 minutes, and then had said nothing because nobody had asked her, and because in this team, in this structure, Rachel Hayes' observations were support data. They were input for the primary operator. They were not themselves the operation. He felt something move through him, not shame exactly. Something more complicated than shame, something that required him to look at 15 years of his own history with a clarity that was genuinely uncomfortable. How many times had Rachel identified something he'd missed? How many times had she been in the background, reading a situation with those extraordinary eyes, processing information that he had walked past without seeing, and said nothing because the structure they operated within had never created space for her to speak? He didn't know. He couldn't know. And that he realized with a slow, settling certainty was precisely the problem. The extraction moved quickly after that. The team had a narrow window, and they used it with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed this part of the operation many times. Moving positions, collapsing equipment, flowing through the terrain in the direction of the extraction point with the controlled urgency of professionals who understood that mission completion was only half the equation, getting home was the other half. Rachel moved with the team, carrying her share of the equipment, occupying exactly the same position in the formation she had occupied during the insertion. Third in the column, behind Martinez in front of Kowalski, the same spot she always held. Support position, background position. Nobody spoke much during the movement. That was normal noise discipline during extraction was standard. But the silence had a different quality than operational silence usually carried. It was denser, more freighted. The silence of 7 people who had just witnessed something they were still processing individually and hadn't yet found a collective language to address. Kowalski caught up with Martinez at a rest point 20 minutes into the movement. Did that just happen? Kowalski barely above a whisper. It happened, Martinez said. Hayes she the second shot. I know. Through the bodyguard gap. While the formation was moving. After collapsing the entrance. In that win. Kowalski. What? I know, Martinez said again. And his voice carried something in it that went beyond simple acknowledgement. He sounded like a man who was recalibrating something, updating an internal picture of the world that had just been significantly revised. Sergeant First Class Danny Reeves, the team's senior ground operator, was moving behind Jack during the extraction, and at the same rest point he came up alongside and matched pace. Commander Reeves said quietly. I know what you're going to say, Jack told him. You don't? Jack glanced at him sideways. Reeves was a compact, weathered man of 51 with the kind of face that had seen everything and responded to most of it with a degree of equanimity that bordered on the philosophy. He had been in special operations for 28 years. He had worked with Jack on 11 deployments. If there was anyone on this team whose opinion Jack genuinely weighted, it was Reeves, Jack said. Reeves was quiet for a few steps. Then I've worked with Hayes for 3 years, I know. Did you know she qualified expert on the M110 in her second week with the unit? Jack didn't answer. Did you know she wrote a ballistics analysis paper 2 years ago that the Naval Special Warfare Center cited in their updated training protocols? The one on atmospheric variance in mountain environments? Jack's jaw tightened slightly. I read it, he said, which was technically true. He had read the executive summary. He had noted it was thorough and moved on. The whole paper includes a section on rotational airflow and valley formations, Reeves said. He wasn't accusing. He wasn't editorializing. He was simply delivering information in the flat, factual way that 28 years of operational experience had taught him to deliver difficult information. She identified the specific meteorological phenomenon that caused your shots to drift. She modeled it. She wrote a 20-page analysis of it 2 years ago. The weight of that landed somewhere in Jack's chest and didn't move. She never mentioned it, Jack said. Nobody asked. 3 words. Simple, factual, and absolutely devastating. Nobody asked. Jack thought about the briefing, the hours of preparation, the discussions around the tactical approach, the entry route, the extraction plan. He thought about the moments when the team had analyzed the target area, the environmental conditions, the variables that would affect the operation. He thought about Rachel sitting in those briefings present, attentive, occasionally offering specific requested data, and he thought about all the space in those briefings where she might have said something, where she might have offered the analysis she had written, where she might have stood up and said, I know something about this that you need to hear. She hadn't, not because she didn't know, not because she was afraid, because the structure of the team, the hierarchy of expertise and reputation that everyone operated within, had never explicitly or implicitly suggested that her unsolicited analysis was welcome. She was support. She was background. She was the person who answered questions when asked and otherwise held her position. And so she had held it for 3 years. Until tonight, when the system failed and the structure cracked open, and the moment finally arrived not through any grand gesture or dramatic announcement, but through 4 quiet words in the dark. I have the shot. The extraction point was a flat area accessible by helicopter, carved into the mountain by geology rather than human effort. When the team reached it, they were 12 minutes ahead of the pickup window, which meant 12 minutes of waiting in the dark and cold, with nothing to do but think. Jack found a position slightly apart from the others and sat with his back against the rock. He was thinking about the laugh. Kareem al-Rashid's laugh, crackling through the radio intercept, contemptuous and triumphant. The laugh of a man who had watched the famous American sniper fail and interpreted that failure as evidence of something fundamental, that the reputation was larger than the reality, that the legend was constructed, that the men who hunted people like him were not what the world believed. He was thinking about how close Kareem had been to being right, not about Jack's career or his record or his 15 years of genuine excellence. Those things were real and they had mattered, and they could not be retroactively erased by one bad night. But Kareem had been right about something more specific, something more uncomfortable. He had been right that in this particular valley, on this particular night, with this particular wind, doing this particular impossible thing, Jack Callahan had trusted his own legend more than he had trusted the truth in front of him. And that was a failure, not of skill, not of courage, not of commitment or professionalism or any of the qualities that had built the reputation in the first place. A failure of humility. He heard footsteps and looked up. Rachel was standing a few feet away. She had a piece of equipment in her hands that she was checking and resetting something that needed doing before the extraction, a technical task, and she wasn't looking at him. But she had chosen to do this particular task in this particular spot, and Jack understood that this was not entirely accidental. How long, he asked? She looked up from the equipment. How long what? How long have you been able to make that shot? Rachel considered the question with the same careful attention she gave to everything. The mechanics? Probably 3 years. Tonight. What changed tonight? Nothing changed, she said. Tonight I just didn't have the option of waiting. Jack turned that over. You've been waiting for permission. I've been waiting for necessity, she corrected. And there was something in the way she said it, not correcting him as a challenge, but correcting him because precision mattered, and the distinction was real, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up slightly. Because she was right, and the difference between those two things was enormous, and it told him something about Rachel Hayes that he should have understood years ago. She was not the kind of person who needed permission. She was the kind of person who understood that throwing yourself into the center of things before the moment was ready was wasteful, that preparation and patience and waiting for the necessary moment was not passivity, was not waiting for permission, was not timidity or lack of confidence. It was strategy, the most advanced kind of strategy, the kind that required knowing yourself well enough to know exactly when to move and exactly when to stay still. You wrote a paper, Jack said, 2 years ago, about rotational airflow in mountain valleys. Rachel's expression shifted slightly, just slightly. A movement in the area around her eyes that might have been surprise or might have been something else. Reeves told you. Should you have told me? She was quiet for a moment. Probably. I thought about it. I decided it wasn't my place. It was exactly your place, Jack said. Yes. She met his eyes directly. In practice, Commander, when is the last time you asked me what I thought about something operational? Not about communications or intelligence data or coordination logistics. What I actually thought about the tactical situation. Jack held her gaze. He did not answer because the answer was never, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud would not change the fact or add anything to what had already been understood. Rachel looked back down at her equipment. I'm not saying that as an accusation, she said quietly. The structure is what it is. You operate within it. We all operate within it. It's just sometimes the structure leaves things on the table that shouldn't be left there. Things like you, Jack said. She shrugged, but it wasn't a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of someone who had made peace with something over a long period of time and no longer carried it as a wound, even if the facts of it remained unchanged. Things like a lot of people, she said. I'm not special in that regard. The helicopter appeared at the edge of the window, coming in low and fast the way extraction birds always did. No drama, just function, the beautiful, purposeful efficiency of the machine doing exactly what it was built to do. The team began moving toward the landing area, each operator knowing their position in the extraction sequence without needing to be told. Rachel moved back to her spot in the formation, third in the column. Behind Martinez in front of Kowalski, Jack watched her go. And then, because it needed to be said before they were back and not in the noise and confusion of the debrief, before the institutional machinery took over and began the process of translating what had happened tonight into official language, he said, Hayes. She turned. What you did tonight, said. All of it. Not just the shots. All of it, the preparation, the paper, the 4 minutes identifying the wind, the patience. All of it. He paused because the sentence needed to end in exactly the right place, and he was trying to find it. I saw it, he said. I'm going to make sure other people see it. Rachel looked at him for a moment. Her expression was unreadable in the dark, or maybe it was readable, and he simply didn't know her face well enough yet to read it. Thank you, Commander, she said. Then she turned back toward the helicopter, and the rotors were loud now, and the extraction was happening, and the mountain was releasing them back into the world changed. All of them, in ways they were only beginning to understand. Jack was the last aboard. He looked back at the valley one final time. The tunnel, the disabled vehicle, the 40 meters that had made the difference between catastrophe and something else. He thought about 2 missed shots and the laugh that followed them, and the silence that had come after Rachel fired, and the moment the vehicle swerved, and Reeves's voice delivering 3 words that had hit him harder than anything he'd experienced in 15 years of operations. Nobody asked. He climbed into the helicopter. The door closed. And somewhere in the darkness below them, the mountain kept its silence, indifferent and ancient and completely unmoved by the human events that had played out on its surface tonight. The wind continued doing its strange rotational thing in the valley, the same phenomenon it had been doing for thousands of years before anyone arrived to be affected by it. The mountain did not know or care that the clock had missed. It did not know or care that a woman nobody had fully seen had stepped into the empty position and done something extraordinary. It simply continued being a mountain. But the people on that helicopter were not mountains. They were carrying something with them now, all of them, each in their own way that had not existed before tonight. Something that would change the way they moved through the world. Something that would surface in unexpected moments, in briefings and training sessions, and the quiet conversations that happen between operators who have been through something together that they can't quite put into ordinary language. What they were carrying was the specific, irreversible knowledge that the most prepared person in a room is not always the person standing at the front of it. and that knowledge was going to matter. In ways none of them could yet predict, it was going to matter very much. The helicopter banked away from the mountain. Jack looked at Rachel across the cabin. She had her eyes closed and her head back against the fuselage, but he could tell from the quality of her stillness that she wasn't sleeping. She was doing what she always did, what she had apparently always done from the first day she arrived in this unit. She was thinking, she was preparing, she was in some quiet and invisible way getting ready for whatever came next. Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the darkness rushing past below. And for the first time in 15 years, Commander Jack Callahan did not feel like the most important person in the aircraft. It was not a comfortable feeling. But he was slowly beginning to understand a true one. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, even truth that required him to see himself differently, even truth that arrived at 12,000 feet on a freezing Afghan night through the evidence of two missed shots and one woman who had made the impossible look routine truth was the only thing worth building on. Everything else was just reputation. And reputation, as tonight had proven with absolute clarity, was no substitute for being ready. The debrief started at 300 Bagram. A room that smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, and a table that had seen enough classified conversation to fill several books that would never be written. 7 operators, 1 mission commander, 2 intelligence analysts, and a man from Langley whose name nobody had been given, and whose presence communicated very clearly that tonight's operation had layers that extended well beyond what the team had been told in the original briefing. The man from Langley sat at the end of the table with a legal pad and a pen and an expression of careful professional that trained intelligence professionals wear the way other people wear clothing, not as a disguise exactly, but as a functional tool. He hadn't spoken yet, taking notes, letting the debrief unfold at its own pace while he absorbed everything and revealed nothing. Mission Commander Colonel David Marsh sat at the head of the table. He was 53, career Navy, the kind of officer who had survived long enough in special operations to have developed very specific relationship with unexpected outcomes. He neither celebrated them prematurely nor catastrophized them before all the information was in. He had heard the radio traffic on the mountain. He knew the broad outline of what had happened. But he needed the full picture, and he needed it now, because the full picture was going to determine what happened next in ways that went far beyond a single mission debrief. "Walk me through it from the beginning," Marsh said. "Jack, you start." Jack had been sitting with his hands flat on the table, staring at a point approximately 18 inches in front of him for the past 4 minutes. He looked up when Marsh said his name. His eyes were clear, not the glassy clarity of someone in shock, but the hard, deliberate clarity of someone who has made a decision about how to proceed and is committed to it. "First shot missed left by approximately 8 inches, Jack said. "Wind-induced trajectory deviation. I had assessed the conditions as manageable based on surface indicators. That assessment was wrong." Marsh nodded slowly. "Wrong how?" "There's a rotational airflow phenomenon in that valley formation. Counter-rotation at elevation. The surface indicators were accurate at ground level, but the bullet traveled through a zone with completely different characteristics in the final third of its flight path." Jack paused. "I didn't identify it." Lieutenant Commander Hayes identified it within 4 minutes of reaching the position. The room was quiet. The man from Langley's pen moved slightly. "She identified it before the shots," Marsh asked. "And communicated that to you?" "No." Jack held Marsh's gaze without flinching. "She communicated it after. During the mission, she hadn't been asked." The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind of silence that happens when a group of professionals simultaneously absorbs a piece of information that requires recalibrating something. Martinez was looking at the table. Kowalski was looking at his hands. Reeves was looking at Jack with the particular expression of a man watching someone do something difficult and choosing to honor it with attention. After the second shot missed, Jack continued. The target was moving toward the armored vehicle. Window closing. Hayes moved to the position. He stopped, considered, then said it exactly as it had happened. "I stepped aside." Marsh leaned back in his chair slightly. "You stepped aside. She said she had the shot. She was right." Jack looked at Marsh steadily. "She disabled the vehicle with the first round. Single shot to the mechanical system at range, in the rotational wind, on a moving target. Then she collapsed the tunnel entrance to break the bodyguard formation and took the second shot through the gap. Target eliminated. He paused one final time. I didn't do that. She did. The man from Langley's pen stopped moving. He looked up from his legal pad for the first time since the debrief began. And he looked at Rachel. Rachel was sitting in the same position she always occupied in these settings, slightly back from the primary line of the table, present but not centered. The geometry of the seating arrangement itself, reflecting the institutional assumptions about her role. She was looking straight ahead, her hands loose in her lap, her expression the same calm that had characterized everything she had done since they reached the ridge. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he said. In your own words, Rachel straightened slightly. The valley formation creates a rotational airflow pattern at approximately 800 feet elevation. I identified the phenomenon during initial position assessment. The counter-rotation affects trajectory in the final third of flight path, which is why both shots drifted consistently left, not random deviation, systematic. Once I understood the pattern, the correction was calculable. The vehicle shot, Marsh said. Walk me through that decision. The target was armored. Windows were ballistic glass angle, and thickness made a clean penetration shot low probability in those conditions. The mechanical system had an accessible point on the undercarriage exposed driveline component. Single round to that point at that angle would cause progressive mechanical failure. Predictable, controllable. I had the angle from our position. And you knew this before you took the position? I had observed the vehicle during the target acquisition window. Yes, so when you moved to the rifle, Marsh said carefully, you already had a plan. I had two plans, Rachel said, and a contingency. The room absorbed that. Kowalski made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, involuntary, the sound a person makes when something lands unexpectedly hard. Martinez reached over and put a hand briefly on Kowalski's arm, which was the closest thing to expressing what both of them were feeling that the setting allowed. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then the tunnel entrance, that wasn't in either plan. That was the contingency, Rachel said. If the bodyguard formation was too tight for a direct shot on the target while moving, the fastest way to create separation was environmental disruption at the point they were moving toward. The entrance support was degraded. Single round would cause partial collapse. Not dangerous to personnel at that distance, but enough to trigger formation protocol. Protection units separate when the environment ahead becomes unknown. It creates a gap. How long did you have to observe the tunnel entrance before making that call? Rachel considered. 40 seconds, approximately. 40 seconds. Jack was watching Marsh process this, and he was watching the man from Langley process it, and he was watching the rest of the team process it, and what he saw on all of their faces was the same thing, a recalibration happening in real time. Not surprise exactly. Something deeper than surprise. The particular cognitive experience of realizing that you have been looking at something for a long time without seeing it. Lieutenant Commander, the man from Langley said, it was the first time he had spoken. His voice was measured and careful and gave away nothing about the organization he represented except its general preference for precision. How long have you been developing this level of precision work? Rachel looked at him directly. I've been studying atmospheric ballistics for 6 years. Mountain-specific environmental effects for 4. I wrote a formal analysis 2 years ago that the Naval Special Warfare Center incorporated into their updated mountain operations protocol. I've read that paper, the man from Langley said. Something shifted in Rachel's expression, barely perceptible. But Jack, who was now watching her face with the focused attention he should have been giving it for 3 years, caught it. Then you know more about my work than most people in this room, she said. Factual. Not bitter, just accurate. The man from Langley nodded once. Yes, he said, I do. And then he looked back down at his legal pad and his pen started moving again, and whatever he was writing filled half a page before he stopped. The debrief continued for another 2 hours. By the time it concluded, the institutional machinery was already beginning to move in the way that institutional machinery moves when something significant has occurred that doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. Forms needed to be filed. Reports needed to be written. Recommendations needed to be made. The mission had succeeded, which was the primary metric by which everything else would be evaluated. But the how of the success created complications that the standard forms were not designed to accommodate. Jack stayed after the others filed out. Marsh stayed too. They sat across from each other at the empty table for a moment without speaking, which was the kind of communication that becomes available only between people who have known each other long enough to have developed a shared language of silence. You did the right thing, Marsh said finally. I know, Jack said. That's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? Jack looked at the door through which Rachel had walked out. 3 years, he said. She's been in this unit for 3 years. And I couldn't tell you the first thing about how her mind works, what she knows, what she can do. He paused. That's on me. Marsh was quiet. The paper she wrote, Jack continued. I read the summary. I filed it under background material and moved on. I didn't ask her about it. I didn't ask her anything about her research. I didn't ask her anything about what she observed in the field that went beyond her designated functions. He let that sit for a moment. I treated her like a very good support operator. She's something else entirely, and I missed it for 3 years. The structure, Marsh started. The structure reflects our assumptions, Jack said, and our assumptions were wrong. He looked at Marsh directly. What happens to her now, officially? Marsh's expression became carefully neutral in a way that told Jack the answer was complicated. That's being determined by whom? People above my pay grade. What does that mean for her practically? Marsh leaned forward slightly. Jack, you know how this works. The mission was classified. The specifics of how it was completed are classified. The official record is going to give her credit, Jack said. It wasn't a question. Marsh was quiet for one beat too long. David Jack's voice had an edge in it now. Not loud, not theatrical, but present. Tell me the official record is going to reflect what actually happened on that mountain. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. There are people who feel that the mission outcome is what matters, that the specific sequence of events, who took which shot, how the position changed, is operational detail that doesn't need to be elevated in the official record. Jack stared at him. There are people, Marsh continued carefully, who feel that the existing narrative, Jack Callahan's mission, Jack Callahan's completion, is simpler, cleaner, more consistent with the public posture on special operations capability, and that making changes to that narrative raises questions they'd prefer not to answer. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any they'd shared before. It was the silence of a man understanding that the fight he had thought was over, the internal fight, the private reckoning he'd had with himself on the mountain, was not over at all. That it had simply changed location. That it had moved from a ridge in Afghanistan to a conference room in Virginia, and that the adversary was no longer the wind or his own assumptions, but something more familiar and, in some ways, more difficult. Institutional inertia, the weight of established narrative, the preference of comfortable systems for outcomes that don't require them to change. Who are these people? Jack asked. You know I can't tell you that. Can I talk to them? Marsh studied him. You're going to make this difficult, aren't you? I'm going to make it accurate, Jack said, which I understand might be the same thing. Marsh nodded slowly, said nothing, which was in its own way an answer. Jack left the debrief room and found the corridor empty except for Reeves, who was leaning against the wall with a paper cup of bad coffee and the expression of a man who had been waiting. How bad? Reeves said. They want to keep the story simple, Jack told him. Reeves processed that, meaning they want to keep your name on it, meaning they want to keep the narrative consistent. Same thing. Reeves took a sip of his coffee, made a face. What are you going to do? I'm going to find Hayes. Reeves straightened. Tonight? Right now. Rachel was in the equipment storage room, which was where she went after debriefs, not because she was required, but because she was the kind of person who processed difficult experiences through physical activity, through the concrete and manageable work of checking, cleaning, resetting. It was something Jack learned about her in this moment, walking into the storage rooms at 530 and finding her methodically going through equipment with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with her hands while her mind worked. She looked up when he entered. Read his face immediately. What happened after I left? Not a question. The official record, Jack said. There are people who want to keep it simple. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the equipment in her hands. I know, she said quietly. You know, I expected it. She set the equipment down carefully. Jack, I'm a female support operator who came out of nowhere and completed a shot that the team's primary sniper missed. That story has about 7 different problems from an institutional perspective. She met his eyes. I expected the official record to reflect the version that caused the fewest problems. The fact that she had expected it, the fact that she had anticipated this outcome and arrived at something like acceptance before the debrief was even finished hit Jack harder than he was prepared for. Not acceptable, he said. Maybe not, but it's predictable. She held his gaze steadily. Commander, I didn't take that shot to get credit for it. I took it because it needed to happen, and I was the only one who could make it happen in that moment. The mission succeeded. The target is eliminated. The materials are not reaching their destination. Those things are true regardless of what the official record says. The truth should be in the official record. Yes, Rachel said. A pause. Are you going to make that happen? I'm going to try. She studied him. Why? The question stopped him. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer had several layers. And he was trying to identify which one was the most honest. Because it's right, he said. And because I spent 15 years building a reputation on the idea that I don't hide from the truth. Turns out the first real test of that wasn't on a mountain. It's right here. Something in Rachel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but something moved behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, something that might have been, very quietly, hope. The next 72 hours moved the way institutional battles always move slowly on the surface, with enormous pressure building underneath. Jack made calls. He wrote his own preliminary report with a specificity and clarity that left no interpretive room, every shot documented, every decision attributed to the person who made it, every moment of the sequence laid out with the precision of a man who understood that the details were exactly where the truth died. He requested a meeting with Marcia's superior. He was told that meeting was being scheduled. He requested it again. He was told it was being reviewed. He requested it a third time and added in writing that he was prepared to contest any official record that did not accurately reflect the events of the operation. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. In the meantime, the man from Langley had not been idle. He appeared at Rachel's door at 900 on the second day after the mission, which surprised her not because she hadn't expected the agency's interest, but because she hadn't expected it to arrive so directly, so quickly, and in a form that bypassed the normal military chain of command entirely. Walk with me, he said. They walked. Through the base out to an area where the foot traffic was minimal and the ambient noise provided a degree of privacy. The man from Langley, whose name Rachel had now been told was Hartwell, was compact and deliberate in his movements, and he spoke the way he took notes with careful precision, selecting each word with the attention of someone who understood that language was a tool that could be precise or imprecise, and that precision mattered. I read your paper 2 years ago, he said. You mentioned that, Rachel said. What I didn't mention was that I flagged it internally, made a note that the author represented a significant analytical capability and recommended follow-up evaluation. He paused. That follow-up didn't happen because the recommendation got lost in the institutional machinery, which I find regrettable. Rachel looked at him sideways. What does that mean practically? It means the agency has an interest in precision operators with exceptional analytical capability who can function effectively under extreme conditions, Hartwell said. And it means that what happened on that mountain 2 nights ago was not a surprise to everyone who was watching. Rachel stopped walking. Hartwell stopped too and looked at her with an expression of patient attention. You were watching the operation specifically, Rachel said. We were watching the mission, as we watch all operations with this level of consequence. A pause. But yes, I was also watching you specifically, based on the flagged recommendation, which was, as events have demonstrated, well-founded. The weight of that landed differently than Rachel expected. Not as validation, she didn't need external validation to know what she had done on that mountain, but as information, as evidence of something she had suspected but never confirmed, that she had not been as invisible as she had believed, that someone somewhere had seen her, had written it down, had tried imperfectly and unsuccessfully to make something happen. The official record, Rachel said carefully, will reflect the truth, Hartwell said. That process is already in motion. Jack Callahan submitted a report this morning that is unambiguous on every point, and the agency has its own record of the intercept data, the sensor data, the satellite imagery, all of which corroborates exactly what he wrote. That's not how these things usually go, Rachel said. No, Hartwell agreed, it isn't. He paused. Commander Callahan is an unusual man. Rachel was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't quite anything physical. Yes, she said. He is. They walked back in silence, And Rachel spent the walking time doing what she always did: processing, analyzing, taking in new information and integrating it with existing understanding to build a more complete picture. She was thinking about the mission, about the papers she had written 2 years ago, in the evenings, in the quiet hours when the unit was winding down and she was still working, still thinking, still building the analytical framework that had allowed her to read that valley in 4 minutes and identify what Jack had missed in 27. She was thinking about the 3 years of holding her position, third in the formation, behind Martinez and in front of Kowalski, waiting for necessity. She was thinking about how tonight had not been the first time she had seen something that the primary operators missed. It had simply been the first time the circumstance made it impossible to stay quiet. And she was thinking about what that meant, about all the missions before this one where she had observed something, identified something, understood something, and had filed it internally and moved on, because the structure didn't create space for it, and because she had made peace with operating within the structure even when the structure was costing them. How much had it cost them? How many operations had proceeded on incomplete information because the person with the complete information was third in the formation and nobody had thought to ask? She didn't have an answer to that question. The historical record wasn't transparent enough to know. But the question itself mattered enormously. And the fact that it was finally being asked by her and by Jack, and apparently by a man from Langley who had been watching her paper for 2 years, suggested that something was genuinely changing. The question was whether it would change fast enough to matter. Martinez found her that afternoon. He had been looking for her for a while. She could tell from the slightly compressed energy he carried when he found her, the look of a man who has been sitting with something difficult and needed to set it down somewhere. He sat down across from her and put his hands on the table between them and looked at them for a moment before looking up. "I owe you an apology," he said. Rachel shook her head slightly. "Martino, listen." He looked at her directly. "I've been in this unit for 4 years. You've been here for 3. And in 3 years, I've never once asked you what you thought about a tactical situation. Not once. I've asked you about intelligence, data, communications, logistics, never about the actual operation." He paused. "That night on the ridge when you said you had the shot, my first instinct was to say no, to pull you back. And the only reason I didn't say it out loud is because everything was happening so fast and the mission commander was on the line and there wasn't time." He paused. "I'm glad I didn't say it, but I want you to know that I almost did. And the reason I almost did had nothing to do with your capability, because I didn't know your capability. It had everything to do with my assumptions." Rachel looked at him for a long time. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me that. I'm going to do better." "I know you are," she said. And she meant it not as a polite deflection, but as genuine assessment, because Martinez was the kind of man who did what he said he was going to do, and who said things he meant rather than things that sounded good. It was one of the reasons she had always trusted him, even when he wasn't asking the right questions. The official report was finalized 36 hours after the mission. It reflected the truth. Every shot, every decision, every moment of the sequence, from Jack's first trigger pull to Rachel's second. The man from Langley's involvement in ensuring the sensor data was incorporated had made it significantly harder to construct a sanitized version, and Jack's preliminary report had set a standard of specificity that the final document was compelled to match. Rachel received a copy at 1,400. She read it in the equipment storage room, sitting on a crate, alone. She read it slowly and carefully, the way she read everything, not looking for errors, but absorbing information, understanding it fully before moving on. When she finished, she sat with it for a moment. Her name was in it. Everywhere her name needed to be, it was there. She set the report down on the crate beside her and sat quietly for a minute or two, thinking about nothing in particular and everything simultaneously, the way the mind works when it reaches a moment that it has been approaching for a long time without knowing it. 3 years. 3 years of third in the formation, behind Martinez, in front of Kowalski. 3 years of the reports and papers and analyses that she wrote in the quiet hours and filed in places where they were read by some people and ignored by others. 3 years of watching and learning and preparing for a necessity that she had never been entirely certain would arrive. It had arrived, and she had been ready, not because of luck, not because the stars had aligned or the moment had found her or fate had intervened. She had been ready because readiness is not an accident and never has been. It is the product of thousands of hours of work done quietly, without acknowledgement, without certainty that the work will ever matter, sustained by nothing except the internal conviction that doing the thing properly is worth doing even when nobody is watching, especially when nobody is watching. She picked up the report, set it down again. And then Jack Callahan appeared in the doorway of the storage room for the second time in 36 hours, and his face looked different from how it had looked the first time. Something had settled in it. Some internal argument that had been ongoing had reached a conclusion, and the conclusion was visible in the quality of his presence steadier, somehow, than she had ever seen him. As if losing 2 shots on a mountain and fighting for the truth in a conference room had paradoxically made him more himself rather than less. "You read it," he said. "Yes." "Does it accurately reflect what happened?" "Yes," she said. "It does." He nodded, stood in the doorway for a moment. "Then the Navy is going to make decisions about next steps. For both of us. I don't know what those decisions will look like, but I want you to know that whatever is offered to you, you have earned it. Completely. Without qualification." Rachel looked at him. "And what about you? What does next steps look like for you?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that my next step is figuring out what I missed by not asking the right questions for 15 years. That's going to take some time." "That's a good next step," Rachel said. "It's a start," he agreed. He stayed in the doorway for one more moment, and Rachel had the sense that he was trying to something else, something that didn't have easy language yet, something that existed just outside the boundary of what words could comfortably reach. She understood that. She had lived in that territory for 3 years. She saved him the effort of finding the words. "You stepped aside," she said quietly, "on that mountain, when it mattered most. You let go of something enormous because the mission required it." She held his gaze. "Most people can't do that, especially not people who've been the clock for 15 years. Jack absorbed that. "It didn't feel like letting go," he said. "It felt like finally seeing clearly." Rachel nodded. "Sometimes those are the same thing." He left. And Rachel sat alone in the storage room with the official report on the crate beside her, and she thought about the mountain, and the wind, and the 40 meters, and the laugh that had crackled through the radio just before everything changed. She thought about the shot, the first one, the vehicle, the feeling of the trigger under her finger, and the complete absence of fear because there was simply no room for it, no gap between knowing and doing. She thought about the second shot, the one through the gap, the one that nobody on that ridge had believed was possible, until it wasn't impossible anymore. She thought about 3 years of preparation, meeting one moment of necessity. And she thought about the simple, profound truth that had governed all of it. From the beginning, the truth that the mountain knew, and the wind knew, and that the official report now reflected in black and white. The battlefield does not ask who you are. It only asks what you can do. And Rachel Hayes had known for a very long time exactly what that answer was. She had simply been waiting for the question. The ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday. Building 36 at the Naval Special Warfare Command Compound in Coronado, California. A room that had hosted hundreds of these events over the decades: medal presentations, promotion ceremonies, unit commendations, a room with a specific institutional gravity to it, the accumulated weight of all the significant moments that had taken place within its walls. The kind of room that makes people stand a little straighter when they walk into it, not because anyone tells them to, but because the room itself seems to demand it. It was 900 when the principals began assembling. Rear Admiral Thomas Greer, Naval Special Warfare Command, stood at the front of the room with the particular stillness of a senior officer who has presided over enough of these events to have developed a practiced ease with the formality of them. He was 61, silver-haired, career Navy from his first day to what was shaping up to be a distinguished final chapter before retirement. He had read the mission report. He had read Jack's preliminary report and the official final version and the intelligence community's corroborating documentation. He had had 3 conversations with people above his own pay grade about how this ceremony should be structured and what narrative it should reinforce. Those conversations had been uncomfortable. The people above his pay grade had preferences. Preferences that were not unreasonable exactly. Given the institutional considerations involved, the public narrative around special operations capability, the sensitivities around classified mission details, the various overlapping equities of different agencies and commands and offices that all had some stake in how this story was told. They had been polite about expressing those preferences. Diplomatic. They had used language like operational security and narrative consistency and the importance of maintaining public confidence. What they meant, stripped of the diplomatic language, was simple. Keep Jack Callahan as the hero. Keep the story clean. Don't create complications. Greer had listened to all of it. He had not committed to anything. And now he was standing at the front of Building 36 at 900 on a Thursday, watching the room fill up, and he was still deciding. Jack arrived at 850. He was in his dress uniform, which he wore with the ease of someone who had put it on many times but had never fully made peace with the performative aspect of it, the medals and insignia that turned a person into a symbol of something larger than themselves. He looked exactly like what he was, a highly decorated, deeply experienced special operations officer who was about to receive another commendation for a mission that, in the official record, he had completed. He found his seat. He looked at the medal case on the table at the front of the room, and he thought about the mountain. He had been thinking about the mountain continuously for the 11 days since they returned. Not with the obsessive, circular quality of a man caught in a trauma loop. He knew what that felt like, and this wasn't it. This was different. This was the focused, deliberate thinking of a man who is working through something important and refuses to move on until he has understood it completely. He had thought about the wind and his assumptions. He had thought about Rachel's paper and the summary he had filed and moved on from. He had thought about the 3 years during which she had been third in the formation, while carrying analytical capability that could have changed the way they operated on every deployment. He had thought about Reeves's 3 words nobody asked, and the way those 3 words had landed in his chest, like something with physical weight. And he had thought about today, about what was going to happen in this room, about what he was going to do when it happened. He had made his decision 11 days ago in the equipment storage room when Rachel had said, "You stepped aside," and his response had been, "It felt like finally seeing clearly." The decision had been clear then, and it was clear now, and the intervening 11 days had not changed. It had, if anything, made it more resolute, because in 11 days he had watched the institutional machinery try in various subtle and not so subtle ways to rewrite what had happened, and every attempt had made him more certain that the alternative was unacceptable. Rachel arrived at 855. She was also in dress uniform, which she wore differently from Jack, not with discomfort, but with a kind of understated precision, as if she had put it on in exactly the right way, and now it would simply stay that way without requiring further attention. She found her seat in the second row, slightly off-center, which was where support operators typically sat at these events. Not the front row, not the margin, the second row. Still background, still third in the formation. She and Jack made eye contact briefly as she sat. He gave her a very small nod. She held his gaze for a moment, reading it, and then she nodded back. She didn't know exactly what he was planning, but she knew him well enough now, 11 days of conversations that had been more honest than anything in the preceding 3 years of working together, to know that whatever he was planning, it was going to be true. The room filled. Martinez and Kowalski sat together in the third row. Reeves sat beside them. The rest of the team occupied the same general area, the quiet clustering of people who have been through something together and find themselves naturally gravitating toward each other in public settings. The man from Langley Hartwell was in the back row. Jack noticed him immediately. Hartwell caught Jack's glance and held it for a moment, then looked forward again. His expression communicated nothing except presence. He was here, he was watching. What he would do with what he observed was his own business. At 902, Rear Admiral Greer called the room to attention. The ceremony began with the standard formal language, the kind of prose that military ceremonies have used for generations, sonorous and dignified and slightly removed from ordinary human speech, the language of institution rather than individual. Greer read the citation for the mission. He used the careful, approved language of the official record, every detail accurate, nothing false, but structured in a way that allowed the listener to form a particular impression without explicitly stating it. He read Jack's name. He described the mission's success. He moved toward the commendation, and then Jack stood up, not dramatically, not with any theatrical gesture or announcement. He simply stood in the middle of the ceremony at the moment when the Rear Admiral was reaching for the medal case, and the simple act of standing when one was supposed to be sitting created an immediate, crackling attention in the room. Every eye moved to him. The Rear Admiral stopped. His hand remained near the metal case, but did not open it. "Admiral Greer," Jack said. His voice was level and clear and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "With your permission, there's something I need to say." Greer looked at him. The room was absolutely silent. The expression on Greer's face was complex, a career officer's response to an unexpected variable, working through multiple considerations simultaneously with the speed that 61 years of experience made possible. He could shut this down. He had every institutional right to do exactly that, to say, "This is not the time," and proceed with the ceremony and deal with whatever Callahan had to say afterward in private. He could. He looked at Jack for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "The floor is yours, Commander." Something exhaled in the room, not audibly, but perceptibly, like a held breath released. Jack turned to face the assembled group. He did not look at the metal case. He did not look at Greer. He looked at the people in the room, his teammates, the support staff, the officers he had served with and alongside for 15 years, and he spoke with the directness of a man who has thought carefully about what he needs to say and is not going to waste anyone's time getting there. 11 days ago, in the mountains of Afghanistan, I missed 2 shots, he said. The room did not move. I had been in position for 27 minutes. I had assessed the environmental conditions and concluded they were manageable. That assessment was wrong. There was a rotational airflow phenomenon in the valley that I failed to identify. Both shots drifted as a result. The target was not eliminated. The mission was failing. He paused, not for dramatic effect, because the next part needed its own space. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes identified the atmospheric phenomenon within 4 minutes of reaching the position. She had written a formal analysis of exactly this type of environmental condition 2 years ago. She understood what was happening in that valley before I fired the first shot. She said nothing because in 3 years on this team, nobody had created space for her to say something like that in an operational context. That failure of structure is something I intend to address, but it is not the point right now. He looked directly at Rachel for the first time since standing. When the mission was failing, Lieutenant Commander Hayes moved to the rifle. I stepped aside. She disabled the target's vehicle with a single shot to the mechanical system at range, in rotational wind, on a moving target. She then identified a structural weakness in the tunnel entrance, used it to break the bodyguard formation, and eliminated the target through the gap created. She did this in under 90 seconds. She had been in the position for less than 3 minutes. Another pause. "I want to be precise about something," Jack continued. "The official record is accurate. Everything I just said is in the record. But records are read by people who weren't in the room, and the way a record is structured shapes the impression it creates. And I want there to be no ambiguity in this room or anywhere else about what actually happened on that mountain." He turned back to face the front. "Admiral Greer, the medal in that case was prepared for me. I am asking you respectfully to redirect it." The silence in the room was extraordinary. Not the silence of people who don't know what to say. The silence of people who know exactly what they are witnessing and are trying to process the full weight of it. Kowalski had his hand over his mouth. Martinez was completely still, staring at Jack with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that looked very much like respect. Reeves was nodding slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nod of a man watching something he had hoped would happen and wasn't sure would. Hartwell in the back row was writing. Greer set down the metal case. He looked at Jack for a long moment. Then he looked at Rachel. Then he looked back at Jack. "Commander Callahan," he said, "you understand what you're asking?" "Yes, sir," Jack said. "I'm asking you to give the medal to the person who earned it." Greer was quiet for 5 seconds, which was a long time. Then he straightened. "Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes," he said, "please come forward." Rachel did not move immediately. For approximately 2 seconds, she sat completely still in her second-row seat, and the stillness was not the stillness of shock or hesitation, but the stillness of a person absorbing something that they had not permitted themselves to expect. Then she stood, and the movement was controlled and composed, and entirely consistent with how she did everything efficiently, without excess, with the understated precision that was as natural to her as breathing. She walked to the front of the room. She stood before Rear Admiral Greer. And the man, 61 years old, silver-haired, career Navy, who had started this morning uncertain about which decision he was going to make, opened the metal case and looked at what was inside for a moment before looking at Rachel. Lieutenant Commander, he said, and his voice had changed. The ceremony cadence was gone. He was speaking like a man now, not an institution. The official record of this mission reflects your actions with complete accuracy. But complete accuracy in a document is not the same as recognition from the people who were there. He glanced briefly at the teams assembled in the rows behind her. I have been doing this job for a long time, and I want you to know that what I'm about to do is not a consolation. It is not a gesture. It is the correct outcome of this ceremony. He lifted the medal from the case, and somewhere in the middle of that, Rachel Hayes, who had spent 3 years being third in the formation and had written papers in quiet rooms and had held her position without complaint through 100 moments that might have broken a person with less internal certainty, felt something move in her chest that she had not given herself permission to feel in a very long time. She kept her face composed, but her eyes were bright. Greer pinned the medal, stepped back, saluted. The room came to its feet, not on command, not because protocol required it, on its own, organically, the way a room stands when it is responding to something true rather than something required. Martinez was on his feet first, and then Kowalski, and then Reeves, and then the rest of the team, and then the officers and staff who had come to witness what they expected to be a standard commendation ceremony and found themselves instead witnessing something they would describe to people for the rest of their careers. Jack was already standing. He looked at Rachel from across the room. She looked back, and in that look was everything that the mountain had created between them. Not friendship exactly. Not yet, though it would become that over time. Something more foundational than friendship. The specific, irreplaceable bond that forms between people who have seen each other clearly in the worst and most revealing conditions and found that what they saw was worth respecting. Hartwell in the back row was still writing. The reception afterward was held in an adjacent room, and it had the particular quality of receptions that follow unexpected events. Everyone slightly elevated, processing, trying to integrate what they had just witnessed into their existing framework. The conversations were more honest than post-ceremony conversations usually are. People said things they wouldn't normally say because the morning had established a standard of directness that made it awkward to retreat into the usual platitudes. Greer found Jack near the coffee station. That took courage, Greer said quietly. It took accuracy, Jack replied. Courage would have been harder. Greer considered that. The people I spoke with before this ceremony, they're not going to be pleased. I know. There may be professional consequences. There may be, Jack agreed. I thought about that. And Jack looked across the room to where Rachel was standing with Martinez and Kowalski, who were talking to her with the specific animated attention of people who are trying to make up for 3 years of not paying enough attention in a single conversation and are aware of the irony. And I decided that the kind of officer I want to be is the kind who can look the people who served with him in the eye without qualification, Jack said. Everything else is secondary. Greer was quiet for a moment. Then I made the right call this morning. You did, Jack said simply. I want you to know it wasn't easy. The right calls usually aren't, Jack said. Greer nodded, took his coffee, moved away through the crowd. Reeves appeared at Jack's elbow approximately 30 seconds later, as if he had been waiting for the Admiral to clear before moving in. He was holding a paper plate with something on it that appeared to have been intended as food, but had not entirely succeeded. You know what the strangest part of all this is? Reeves said. Tell me, I've been doing this for 28 years. And in 28 years, I have never once seen a primary operator stand up in a commendation ceremony and give the medal away. He took a bite of whatever was on the plate. Not once. In 28 years. There's a first time for everything, Jack said. Yes, there is. Reeves looked at him sideways. How do you feel? Jack thought about the question honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about anything. Lighter, I feel lighter. Reeves nodded. That's what setting something down feels like. Across the room, Hartwell caught Jack's eye. He excused himself from Reeves and made his way through the crowd to where Hartwell was standing slightly apart from the general flow. Near the window, in the same position he occupied in every room present but peripheral, observant but not central. Background, third in the formation. Jack recognized it now in a way he hadn't before. What were you writing? Jack asked.
Throughout the ceremony?
Hartwell almost smiled. Almost, I was writing a report. About the ceremony? About this morning's events, yes. And about the 11 days preceding them, he paused. And about Commander Callahan's decision-making process and its implications. Implications for what? For how we think about leadership in high-stakes operational environments. Hartwell looked at him with the careful attention that seemed to be his primary mode of engaging with the world. What you did on that mountain stepping aside, most people understand it as a sacrifice. A difficult, admirable sacrifice. It wasn't a sacrifice, Jack said. No, Hartwell agreed. It wasn't. It was correct, tactical decision-making in a dynamic environment. You had a better asset available and you deployed it. He paused. But the remarkable thing is that most people with your track record couldn't have made that assessment, not because they lack intelligence or integrity, because the ego investment in their own capability makes it structurally impossible for them to correctly evaluate a situation in which they are not the best available option. Jack was quiet. You were able to do it, Hartwell continued, because somewhere in those 27 minutes on the ridge, something shifted. You stopped defending your own assessment and started actually looking at what was in front of you. He tilted his head slightly. What shifted? Jack thought about it. He had thought about it many times in the past 11 days, and he had arrived at an answer that was true even if it was uncomfortable. The second miss, he said. The first miss I could have explained away. Equipment issue. Unusual conditions. I've had one-off situations before. But the second miss in the same direction, with the same deviation, that was the data that couldn't be argued with. Two data points create a pattern. And the pattern told me that my model of the situation was wrong. He paused. Once I knew my model was wrong, I was looking for what was actually true. And Rachel was right there. Hartwell wrote something down. What does that mean for your report? Jack asked. It means, Hartwell said carefully, that there are people in several agencies and commands who are going to read about what happened on that mountain and have a very serious conversation about how we identify, develop, and deploy people like Lieutenant Commander Hayes, and how we prevent the institutional structures that kept her in the background from continuing to do so. He closed his notebook. It also means that your name is going to be attached to a different kind of story than the one you've been known for. What kind? The kind where the legend stepped aside and made room for something better. Hartwell looked at him steadily. Some people will see that as diminishment. And the rest? The rest will understand it correctly. A pause. As the most significant thing you ever did. Jack absorbed that. Then he looked across the room again to where Rachel was still talking with Martinez and Kowalski, and he watched her for a moment, the way she moved through conversation, the specific quality of her attention, the way she listened to something Martinez was saying with the same focused precision she brought to reading wind patterns in Afghan valley formations. He thought about the paper she had written in quiet evenings, the 4 minutes on the ridge, the 90 seconds that had changed everything. He thought about third in the formation, and nobody asked, and the specific revelatory of watching someone do what they had been preparing to do for years in the moment when it finally mattered. He thought about what Hartwell had just said. The most significant thing you ever did. He had spent 15 years building a reputation on the idea that significance meant capability, that the most significant thing he could do in any given situation was perform at the highest level his training and experience made possible. That significance lived in the shot, in the completion, in the clean execution of the mission. And perhaps that had been true for 15 years. But on a mountain in Afghanistan, in the moment when he had laid down a rifle and said, "I'm stepping aside," he had discovered a different kind of significance. One that didn't live in the performance. One that lived in the recognition, the clear-eyed, ego-free recognition that the person beside you is better positioned to succeed than you are, and that mission success is worth more than personal credit. It was a harder thing to learn than any technical skill he had ever developed. And he was increasingly certain, the most important thing he had ever learned. Rachel found him 20 minutes later. The room had thinned out slightly, the formal energy of the post-ceremony reception beginning to settle into smaller conversations and individual departures. She had been looking for him with the same purposeful attention she brought to everything, and she found him near the back of the room, standing alone in a way that communicated that he was processing rather than isolated. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know," he said. "That's why it meant something." She looked at the medal on her uniform. First time she had looked at it directly since Greer pinned it. "I've been thinking about what you said 11 days ago in the storage room." She paused. You said your next step was figuring out what you missed by not asking the right questions. Yes. Have you started figuring it out? I've started asking the questions, Jack said. Figuring it out is going to take longer. Rachel nodded. There's something I should have told you on the mountain, she said. When you said you missed the wind, I gave you the technical explanation. The rotational airflow, the counter-rotation at elevation. All of that was accurate. Yes. But that wasn't the whole answer. She looked at him directly. You didn't miss the wind because you lacked the knowledge. You missed it because you stopped looking once your existing framework gave you an answer you were comfortable with. The surface indicators said manageable, and manageable was consistent with your experience, so you accepted it. She paused. That's not an experience problem. That's a certainty problem. Experience creates certainty, and certainty creates blind spots, and blind spots get people killed. Jack was quiet for a moment. You're saying I was too certain. I'm saying the most dangerous moment for any operator isn't when they're uncertain, Rachel said. It's when they're certain. Because uncertainty keeps you looking. Certainty makes you stop. He turned that over for a long time. How do you avoid it, he asked. The certainty? Rachel almost smiled. Almost. You stay curious, she said. You treat every operation like the first one. You look at what's actually in front of you instead of what your experience tells you should be there. She paused. And you ask the people around you what they see. Because they're looking at the same thing from a different angle, and sometimes the angle is the whole difference. Nobody asked, Jack said quietly. Nobody asked, Rachel confirmed. The weight of those 3 words hung between them in the same way it had hung in the debrief room 11 days ago. But it was different now. Now it was not just an acknowledgement of a failure, it was a commitment, an agreed upon starting point for something that was going to look different going forward. I want to propose something, Jack said. Formally. When we get back to operational status, Rachel waited. I want to restructure how we use your analytical capability in the pre-mission and mission phases, not as support input that gets reviewed at the commanding officer's discretion, as primary operational intelligence with equal weight at the planning table. He paused. And I want to make sure that when you see something, anything, operational, environmental, tactical, the structure is clear that you say it immediately, without waiting to be asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. That's a significant structural change. It's an accurate structural change, Jack said. There's a difference. She looked at him. And then she said something that caught him completely off guard, not because it was complex, but because it was simple, and because simple, honest things from people who don't offer them casually carry a weight that elaborate expressions never quite match. I'm glad it was you, she said, on that mountain. I'm glad it was you who was there when I had to step forward, because you saw it clearly, and you let it be true. She paused. A lot of people wouldn't have. Jack held her gaze. A lot of people, he said quietly, haven't spent 15 years building something they're willing to put on the table when the truth requires it. Have you, Rachel asked. He thought about the mountain, the metal case, the morning. I'm starting to find out, he said. Hartwell left the reception at 1,100. He walked to his rental car in the parking structure, sat in the driver's seat, and finished his report in the quiet of the car before he drove anywhere. He wrote quickly and with precision, because precision was the tool he trusted most, and because what he had witnessed over the past 11 days from the radio intercept on the mountain to the ceremony this morning deserved to be rendered with exactness. He wrote about Jack Callahan and the 2 missed shots and the decision on the ridge. He wrote about Rachel Hayes and the 4 minutes and the 90 seconds and the paper that had been filed and not acted upon for 2 years. He wrote about the ceremony and the medal and the standing room. And at the end of the report, in a section marked assessment and recommendation, he wrote something that he had been formulating for 11 days and that he believed, with the careful certainty of a man who chose his certainties deliberately, was true. He wrote, the events of this mission and its aftermath demonstrate that the most dangerous gaps in our operational capability are not technical or tactical. They are structural and cultural. We have been systematically underdeploying our most valuable assets by placing them in support roles defined by institutional assumptions rather than actual capability. Lieutenant Commander Hayes represents not an anomaly but a symptom. The question this mission forces us to ask is not how many Rachel Hayeses we have missed on a single mountain in Afghanistan. The question is how many we have in our system right now, third in the formation, waiting for a necessity that our structure is preventing from arriving. He put the pen down, sat in the quiet of the car. Then he started the engine and drove toward the airport, carrying a report that was going to land on desks that needed it and disturb the people behind those desks in ways that were entirely appropriate and long overdue. Outside, the California sun was doing what California sun does, indifferent and bright and completely uninterested in the human events unfolding beneath it. The mountain in Afghanistan had been the same way. It was one of the things that made mountains and sunlight useful teachers. They didn't care about your reputation. They only cared about what was true. Hartwell's report landed on 6 desks in 4 different buildings across Washington in the 72 hours following the ceremony. Not all at once. That was not how these things worked. They arrived in sequence. Each copy, slightly different in its routing, the version that went to Naval Special Warfare Command had certain sections emphasized differently from the version that went to the agency, which was again different from the version that reached the office of the Deputy Secretary of Defense on a Tuesday afternoon, when the Deputy Secretary was between meetings and picked it up with the distracted attention of someone expecting routine paperwork. He read the first page with distracted attention. He read the second page with focused attention. He read the third page without moving, the way people read things that are rearranging something inside them real time. His assistant knocked at 4:30 to remind him about the 5 o'clock briefing. He told her to reschedule it. She started to explain that rescheduling was complicated given who was attending, and he told her again, quietly but with absolute finality, to reschedule it. She left. He read the rest of the report in uninterrupted silence, and when he finished, he sat in his chair for a full 10 minutes without doing anything at all, which his assistant, who had worked for him for 9 years, had never seen him do before. Then he picked up the phone. The call he made went to a senior director at the agency, who was already familiar with the report because Hartwell worked for him and had sent the report directly before filing it through official channels. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It was direct, specific, and concluded with a decision that both men understood would be the first of several significant decisions that Hartwell's 12 pages were going to force. 3 days later, Rachel Hayes received orders. She was in the unit's training facility when the orders arrived, working with 2 junior operators on wind reading methodology, which she had begun doing informally in the weeks since the mission, and which had, without any official sanction or announcement, become a regular thing. The junior operators came to her. She didn't advertise it. Word moved through the unit the way truth moves through close communities quietly, between people, without ceremony. She read the orders twice. Then she sat down. The orders were for a temporary duty assignment to the Naval Special Warfare Center's Training Development Division, where she would serve as the lead subject matter expert on a newly created curriculum module. The module was titled Environmental Precision Analysis in High-Stakes Operational Contexts. It was, in practical terms, the formal institutionalization of everything she had been doing in quiet evenings and unofficial training sessions for 3 years. They were asking her to teach it, not as a support function, not as background material, as primary curriculum with her name on it, carrying the institutional weight of official doctrine. She stared at the orders for a long time. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time in a professional context. She called her mother. Her mother, who lived in Richmond, Virginia, and who had been a school teacher for 31 years, and who had raised Rachel alone after her father left when Rachel was 9, and who had told her daughter from the beginning that the most powerful thing a person can be is the one who knows more than everyone expects and holds it ready until the moment it's needed. "Mom," Rachel said when her mother picked up. Her mother heard something in that single word mothers always do, especially mothers who have been listening to a particular voice for their child's entire life, and she said, "Tell me." So Rachel told her, not the classified parts, not the specific operational details that would never leave the protected spaces they occupied, but the shape of it, the mountain, the wind, the shot that needed to happen, and the 3 years of preparation that made it possible. The ceremony and the medal and the man who had stood up and said she earned it. Her mother was quiet through all of it. When Rachel finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then her mother said, "I have been waiting for this phone call for 6 years." Rachel laughed. It was a real laugh, the involuntary kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than performance, that surprises you with its own realness. She laughed and pressed her hand against her eyes and stayed like that for a moment, feeling something move through her that she recognized as relief, which was interesting because she hadn't known she was carrying the tension that made relief necessary. You knew, Rachel said. Her mother said, which is the same thing. They talked for 45 minutes, which was longer than Rachel had talked to her mother on the phone, in a single conversation in 2 years. When she hung up, she sat quietly for another few minutes, integrating, letting the emotional weight of the morning settle into its proper place. Then she picked up the orders again and read them a third time. And this time reading them, she felt not just acknowledgement but momentum. The specific propulsive feeling of something moving forward that has been stationary for too long. She accepted the assignment the same day. Jack found out about Rachel's orders through Reeves, which was how Jack found out about most things that weren't in his direct chain of command. Reeves had a network of information that operated by principles Jack had never entirely understood but had always respected. It was thorough, it was fast, and it was almost always accurate. Training development, Reeves said, appearing at Jack's office door with the familiar quality of a man who has information and has decided to deliver it in person. Lead subject matter expert, new curriculum module, her name on the doctrine. Jack looked up from his desk. When orders came this morning, she accepted this afternoon. Jack nodded slowly. That's the right move, he said. For her, yes, Reeves said. He stayed in the doorway rather than coming in, which meant he had something else to say and was choosing his moment. What about you? What about me? You've been sitting behind that desk for 3 weeks, writing reports, reviewing training protocols, doing administrative work that a lieutenant could handle. Reeves looked at him steadily. You're not an administrative officer, Jack. Jack leaned back in his chair. I had a conversation with Admiral Greer last week about future deployment considerations. And he said the conversation about my future role was one he wanted to have deliberately rather than by default. Jack paused, which is admiral speak for something is changing, and we haven't decided what yet. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Are you afraid of what it is? Jack considered the question with the same honest attention he had been giving everything since the mountain. No, he said, I'm curious about it, which is different. He paused. 3 weeks ago, I would have been afraid. Now I'm curious. He looked at Reeves. Something changed. A lot of things changed, Reeves said, on that mountain and after it. He finally came into the office and sat down in the chair across from Jack's desk, the informal sit, the one that meant they were going to talk like people rather than officers. Can I tell you what I see? Please, I've worked with you on 11 deployments. You have been the best primary operator I have ever worked alongside. Technically, tactically, under pressure the best. He paused. And for 11 deployments, that's been enough. Being the best at the thing you're best at has been a complete and sufficient identity. But Jack said, but the mountain changed the question, Reeves said. It wasn't enough to be the best at the thing anymore. The moment required something different, and you delivered the different thing, which means you're not just the best operator in the room. You're becoming something harder to find and harder to train. He held Jack's gaze. You're becoming the kind of leader who makes the people around him capable of things they couldn't do without him. Not by being the best performer, by seeing clearly who the best performer is and getting out of their way. Jack was quiet for a long time. That's a harder job, he said finally. Much harder, Reeves agreed, and much more important. The conversation with Admiral Greer happened 2 days later. It was scheduled formally, which was unusual for conversations between Jack and Greer, who had known each other long enough to have an informal working relationship that normally bypassed the scheduling protocols. The formality communicated something that this conversation carried institutional weight that their informal relationship couldn't absorb. Jack arrived at Greer's office at 800. Greer was already there. He gestured Jack toward the chair across from his desk and came around to sit in the chair beside it rather than behind the desk, which was the kind of deliberate physical choice that senior officers make when they want to communicate that a conversation is not going to be hierarchical. I had a conversation with the Deputy Secretary's office yesterday, Greer said. Jack waited. The Hartwell report has created significant interest at several levels. Greer looked at him directly. There is a formal initiative being stood up. Joint, Navy, agency, several other stakeholders. The mandate is to review how we identify and deploy precision analytical capability across special operations units. To find the structural gaps that kept Hayes in a support role for 3 years when she should have been at the primary table. And to fix them. That's the right initiative, Jack said. Yes, Greer agreed. He paused.
They want you to lead it.
Jack went completely still. Not the physical stillness of a sniper settling into a position. Something different. The stillness of a man receiving information that requires a fundamental reorientation of something he thought he understood about where he was going. Me, Jack said. You, Greer confirmed. Not because of your 15 years as a primary operator. Because of what you did after you missed those 2 shots. Because of the decision on the mountain and the report and the ceremony and every conversation you've had in the 3 weeks since. He paused. You understand the problem from the inside. You were the structure that kept Hayes invisible. You changed. And the people who need to fix this believe that a man who can change himself is the right person to change a system. Jack absorbed this for a long moment. Rachel, he said. What does she know about this? She'll be brief today. Her training development role is connected to the initiative she's building the curriculum that the initiative will use to develop the analytical operators the review identifies. Greer paused. You and she will be working together on the implementation side of this. Formally, with equal authority at the table. Something moved in Jack's expression at the words equal authority at the table. It was brief and unguarded, the specific emotional response of a man who hears a phrase and recognizes in it the correction of a specific wrong he has been carrying. I'll take it, Jack said. I know you will, Greer said. I knew before you walked in. Then why the formal meeting? Because it deserved one, Greer said simply. Some things are too important to handle informally. This is one of them. The initiative was announced internally 3 weeks later. The official name was the Operational Capability Integration Review, which was the kind of institutional language that told you almost nothing about the actual content deliberately, because the actual content was going to make some people deeply uncomfortable, and the people who named these things understood that names that sounded like bureaucratic housekeeping generated less resistance than names that sounded like structural challenges to existing power. Jack read the announcement in his new office, a different office from the one he'd had before, in a different building, with a different view and different responsibilities. He read it with the careful attention he gave to all official language now, not just for what it said, but for what it meant beyond what it said. The announcement was accurate. It reflected the truth. He set it down and thought about Rachel, who was at the Naval Special Warfare Center at this moment, in front of a room of operators who were learning for the first time in a formal curriculum with institutional backing how to read what she had been reading for years. He thought about what it would mean for those operators on their next deployment, what it would mean for the missions they ran, the decisions they made, the variables they noticed or failed to notice. He thought about all the valleys with rotational airflow that those operators would now approach differently. He thought about the lives that might depend on it. And he thought about the specific chain of causality that had led from 2 missed shots on an Afghan mountain to a formal institutional initiative designed to prevent the next Rachel Hayes from spending 3 years invisible. 2 missed shots. He had been carrying those missed shots as a failure since the night they happened. He understood now that they were something more complicated than failure. They were the necessary crack in a structure that had needed cracking for a long time. The place where the pressure finally found a way through. If he had made those shots, if the mission had proceeded exactly as planned, with Jack performing at his historic standard and the team returning home with the outcome they expected, none of the rest of it would have happened. The debrief would have been routine. The ceremony would have been routine. Rachel would have returned to 3rd in the formation, and Hartwell's report would never have been written, and 6 desks in 4 buildings would have received different paperwork, and the initiative would not exist. 2 missed shots had changed all of it. He was not glad he had missed. But he was no longer only sorry. The first full session of the integrated curriculum happened 6 weeks after the initiative was announced. 12 operators from 3 different units, brought together for a 5-day immersive program at the Naval Special Warfare Center. The program combined Jack's leadership development framework built on the specific painful lessons of the mountain with Rachel's environmental precision analysis methodology. 2 things that had existed separately, in different rooms, in different people, now formally integrated and taught together as a unified approach to operational decision-making. Rachel ran the technical sessions. Jack ran the leadership sessions. On the 3rd day, they ran a joint session together. It was the session Jack had been most uncertain about when they designed it uncertain, not because he doubted the content, but The content required him to do something that did not come naturally to him, even now, even after everything. It required him to be publicly vulnerable in an operational context, to stand in front of 12 operators and describe, with complete accuracy and no protective framing, the moment he had trusted his reputation over the truth in front of him, the moment he had missed twice, the moment he had stood aside. He had practiced it. Not the way you practice a speech, he wasn't performing it. He had thought it through carefully, finding the exact language that was honest without being theatrical, that was specific without being self-indulgent, that conveyed the truth of the experience without turning the truth into a story about himself. Because that was the thing about the mountain that had taken him the longest to understand. The story was not about him. It was about what the moment revealed, about what becomes possible when you strip away the protection of reputation and operate from the pure, exposed truth of the present moment, about what Rachel had been doing for 3 years in quiet rooms and third in the formation positions, about what all the invisible people and all the institutional hierarchies were doing right now, in units and organizations across every branch of service, waiting for a necessity that the structure might or might not ever allow to arrive. He stood in front of the 12 operators. Rachel was standing to his left, slightly back. He had asked her not to do that, to stand beside him, level the way equal authority at the table required. She had shifted forward. Old habits they were discovering required active and repeated correction. 11 weeks ago, Jack said, I missed 2 shots. In a valley in Afghanistan, with rotational airflow at elevation that I failed to identify, in 27 minutes of position time, because I trusted a framework that told me the conditions were manageable and stopped looking for information that would have told me they weren't. He paused. The person standing next to me identified the phenomenon in 4 minutes. She had written a 20-page formal analysis of exactly this atmospheric condition 2 years earlier. Nobody in my unit had ever asked her about it in an operational context. The 12 operators were very still. What I'm going to describe to you this morning, Jack continued, is not a story about a sniper who missed. It's a story about what happens when a system assumes it knows where its best assets are and stops looking. He looked at the faces in front of him. Some of them were young, early 30s, the age he had been when he was becoming the clock, when the reputation was still being built rather than maintained. Some were older, more seasoned, wearing 15 or 20 years of deployment experience in the particular way that experience wears on people who have been in difficult places. Every one of you has a Rachel Hayes in your unit, maybe more than one. The question I want you to leave here asking is not whether they exist. It's whether you're asking them the right questions. Rachel stepped forward, not dramatically, just forward, to level the way they had agreed. Her presence beside him had a specific quality to it, not the quality of a support operator who has been invited to speak, but the quality of a primary authority in her own right, which was what she was, and which the physical positioning now reflected. The atmospheric phenomenon Commander Callahan is describing, she said, moving into the technical content with the seamless precision of someone who has organized this information many times in her own mind, is present in roughly 30% of mountain valley formations in the operational theaters we work in most frequently. The surface indicators are consistently misleading. Standard pre-shot environmental assessment protocols do not include elevation differentiated wind analysis. She paused. We are going to change that, starting with this room. One of the operators in the front row, a senior chief named Holloway, thick-necked and skeptical-looking, the kind of man who had heard a lot of training presentations in his career and filtered most of them through a finely calibrated sense of what was actually useful versus what sounded good in a classroom, raised his hand. How long does the elevated assessment take? He asked. Under time pressure. 4 minutes, Rachel said. Holloway looked at her. That's what you said you needed on the mountain. Yes. And if you don't have 4 minutes, then you use 2 minutes and accept elevated uncertainty in the calculation, Rachel said, which is still better than 0 minutes of analysis and complete confidence in a wrong framework. She held his gaze. The problem is never time. The problem is the assumption that your existing framework is accurate. Once you stop making that assumption, you start using whatever time you have correctly. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. It was the nod of a man who has been given an answer he can actually use. The session ran for 4 hours. By the end of it, something had happened in the room that good training sessions produce when they are genuinely good, a shift in the atmosphere, A change in the quality of the attention, the specific feeling of people who came in with one set of questions and are leaving with a different and better set. The operators were talking to each other as they gathered their materials. The conversations dense and specific, the kind that happen when people are integrating new information with existing experience and finding that the combination produces something neither one produced alone. Holloway found Rachel after the session. "I have a question," he said. It was direct and without preamble, which was how Holloway apparently operated. "Off the curriculum." "Go ahead," Rachel said. "In your unit, before the mission, before everything that happened." He looked at her steadily. "Did you know you could make that shot?" Rachel looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" "At least a year," she said. "Probably longer." Holloway processed that. "And you never said anything?" "Nobody asked." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face, the same rearrangement that had happened in various faces over the past 11 weeks, the recalibration that Hartwell's report had described, and that Rachel had now watched happen in real time more times than she could count. "I'm going to ask," Holloway said finally. "When I get back to my unit, I'm going to ask every one of them what they know that I haven't asked about." "Good," Rachel said. "It's going to be uncomfortable." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Holloway nodded once, picked up his gear. Rachel watched him go. Jack appeared at her shoulder. He had been at the back of the room wrapping up a conversation with two of the other operators and had caught the end of the exchange with Holloway. "He's going to be one of the ones who actually changes," Jack said. "I know," Rachel said. "You can tell in the first session." "How?" "He asked a real question," Rachel said. "Not a challenging question, not a testing question, a real one, about something he actually needed to know." She paused. "The ones who ask real questions are the ones who are actually here to learn." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Then I asked you a real question, the night after the mission, in the storage room." "Yes," Rachel said. "You did. That was the first real question I'd asked you in 3 years." "Yes," she said again. "It was." He absorbed that. "I'm sorry for the 3 years." "I know you are," Rachel said. And she meant it without reservation, because she had seen the evidence of it every day for 11 weeks, in the way he had fought for the official record, in the ceremony, in the initiative, in the joint curriculum, in the deliberate and repeated work of correcting the habits of hierarchy that didn't disappear just because you recognize them. "And I know you're not going to waste time being sorry when the work is still in front of us." "The work is very much still in front of us," he agreed. They stood in the empty training room for a moment, in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have developed a genuine working relationship built not on easy affinity or shared history, but on the harder foundation of honesty and mutual respect and the specific trust that comes from having been through something real together. Rachel thought about the mountain. She thought about it often, not with the obsessive quality of someone who can't let go of a defining moment, but with the considered attention of someone who understands that defining moments have more to teach than the first reading reveals. She kept finding new things in it, new angles, new understandings that arrived weeks or months after the fact, when some other's experience created the context that let a piece of the mountain finally click into place. The thing she kept coming back to more than any other was the silence before the second shot. Not the tactical silence, not the operational quiet of the position, the breath control, the physical stillness, the internal silence. The silence inside her own mind in the moment before she fired. The absence of doubt or fear, or the need for external validation, or any of the other internal weather that humans carry into difficult moments and that costs them exactly the clarity they need most. She had been silent inside because she had done the work. All of it. The paper no one asked about, the evenings of study, the years of observing and learning and building the analytical framework that let her read a valley in 4 minutes and understand a bodyguard's old injury in 40 seconds. The 3 years of being third in the formation, watching and learning, and adding to the preparation that had no guaranteed outlet, but that she had built anyway. Because you do not prepare for moments you can predict. You prepare for moments you can't. And when the moment arrived, unexpected, urgent, completely outside the normal operational structure, the preparation was there. It had always been there. That was the thing she wanted every operator who came through this program to understand. Not the tactical content that was important and necessary and would save lives, but it was teachable in a more direct way. What she wanted them to understand was the deeper truth beneath the tactics. You do not become ready in the moment. You are ready or you are not. And readiness is built in all the quiet moments that come before. In the evenings and the early mornings and the hours nobody sees. In the questions you ask when nobody is watching. In the preparation you sustain without any certainty that it will ever matter. Because sometimes it doesn't matter. And sometimes it matters completely, entirely, in a way that changes everything. And you cannot know in advance which kind of moment is coming. So you prepare as if every moment might be the one that requires everything you have. 6 months after the mountain, Jack Callahan sat in front of a congressional subcommittee and answered questions about the initiative. The questions were a mix of the genuinely curious and the politically motivated, which was the normal condition of congressional hearings about defense programs. He answered all of them with the same direct, specific honesty he had brought to everything since Afghanistan, and he made sure in every answer, in every formulation, that Rachel's name was attached to the work that she had originated and built and that the initiative existed to scale. One of the subcommittee members, a congresswoman from Georgia, former military herself, with a record of serious engagement with women in special operations issues, asked him directly, "Commander Callahan, in your assessment, how many other operators with Lieutenant Commander Hayes' capability exist in our special operations forces right now who have not been identified or appropriately deployed?" Jack looked at her steadily. "I don't know," he said. And that is exactly the problem. We don't have a way to count them because we haven't had a system designed to find them. We have a system designed to deploy the assets we already know about in the roles we already have for them. That system is efficient at what it does. It is not designed to discover what it doesn't know. He paused. The initiative exists to change that, to build the discovery capacity we don't currently have. And I will tell you, based on the 6 months of this program's operations so far, that the number of Rachel Hayeses in our system is significantly larger than anyone in this room expected. Significantly. The congresswoman looked at him for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because we started asking," Jack said, "and people started answering." The hearing ended at noon. Jack walked out into the Washington afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment, doing what he did now in every quiet moment, not reviewing his performance or rehearsing next steps, but simply being present, feeling the air, noticing what was actually there. Rachel had called him that morning, before the hearing. Not to wish him luck, she wasn't the kind of person who did that. And he had learned to understand that the absence of certain conventional gestures from her was not indifference but precision. She called because she had something specific to say. "Tell them the truth," she had said. "Not the version that sounds best. The version that's actually accurate." "I always do," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." And there, in that short exchange, was the entire relationship, the specific dynamic that had built itself over 6 months of working together, equal at the table, honest about everything, each of them better at their work because the other was in the room. He walked down the steps. The city moved around him in the way that cities move, indifferent to individual stories, full of people carrying their own weights, their own preparations, their own quietly accumulated readiness for moments that might or might not ever arrive. He thought about the mountain one more time, the 2 missed shots, the laugh, the vehicle moving toward the tunnel, the rifle and the woman who moved to it with 4 minutes of environmental analysis in her head and 3 years of preparation in her hands and not one single trace of fear in her eyes. The 40 meters, the silence before the shot. He thought about what Reeves had said in the parking lot 6 months ago on the way out of a late session. "You know what you are now?" Reeves had. "Tell me," Jack said. "You're the guy who made Rachel Hayes possible," Reeves said. "Not by training her, not by teaching her, just by finally getting out of the way and letting her be what she already was." Jack had carried that for 6 months. He was still carrying it, not as a burden, as a compass. Because that was the work now, not the shots, not the missions, not the reputation built over 15 years of being the best at a thing that required being the best alone. The work now was different and harder and more important. The work now was finding every operator who had been third in the formation for years, carrying the preparation that nobody had asked about, waiting for a necessity that the structure kept preventing from arriving, finding them, asking, and then getting out of the way. It would not make him famous. It would not rebuild the legend, but it would put the right people in the right positions at the moment when it mattered most. And in a world where the right person in the right position could mean the difference between catastrophe and survival, between the chemical weapons reaching their destination or not, between the laugh echoing through the radio or the silence that meant the mission was complete in that world. That work was everything. The mountain had taught him that. Rachel Hayes had taught him that. And somewhere on a base that he couldn't name, in a unit that didn't officially exist, a woman was sitting in the back of a briefing room that she had been sitting in for 2 years, watching and learning and building the preparation that nobody had asked about yet. She was waiting, she was ready. And because of what happened on a mountain in Afghanistan, because of 2 missed shots, and 1 woman who stepped forward, and 1 man who stepped aside, because of all of it this time, someone was going to ask. The battlefield does not care about your reputation. It only reveals who was truly ready when the moment arrived. And the moment always arrives.